Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, The Murder of Todd Shoemaker, Part 1. Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. I am Wendy.
And I'm David.
Well, David, we have with us today retired Detective Rob Wilson. How are you, Rob?
I'm doing very well.
Thank you for coming back on our show.
Absolutely. Anytime.
You know, we've had Rob here with us before on the case of Alex Johnson and Megan Liebengood, and now we have Rob here with us on a 2015 murder of Todd Shoemaker.
Is it Schumacher or Maker?
I think it's Schumacher.
Okay, gotcha. We're good. Yeah, I just want to make sure because it's kind of tricky on the spelling a little bit.
Rob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Was on the Lexington Police Department for 23 years. I believe spent 2.5 to 3 years on patrol, then moved into homicide where I believe it was close to 17, 18 years in active homicide, and then finished the last 2 or 3 years of my career running the cold case unit.
Nice. Are you enjoying your retirement days?
Very much so, yes.
Well, I'm sure they miss having you.
Do you miss doing cold case work?
Yeah, I found that it was really challenging because those cases are cold for a reason. And typically those are the more difficult cases because they're cold for a reason. And as you know, we've had some really good detectives in the unit, and it's fun on a couple of different levels, just the challenge to try to find the suspect after so long, but also going back and reading case files that belong to Paul Williams or David Lyons, and just always impressed with those people. You know, just the meticulous documentation that the really good ones do. I actually learned a lot of stuff, like reading through yours and Paul's and Chris's and James Curlis. So I'd always pick up little tidbits like, that's an interesting question they asked. I never would have thought of that.
It's funny when you look at older work, because I was the same way with John Bizak, and I would read his and Dan Gibbons and things like that, and you pick that up too. And of course, the challenge with Paul Williams is it's all in stone. Those things are incredibly heavy to carry around.
It took forever.
Yours isn't too far behind, so
no, just probably chalk or some kind of a burnt wood, I think is what we used.
We always joke that Paul and Chris Schoonover, their search warrant, they were the first detective to do a search warrant in Pangea.
There we go. Exactly. Well, aside from that too, just do you have a rough idea of, not that it's a contest, but do you have a rough idea how many cases cold cases you laid down or felt like the ball moved significantly forward before you left? Any kind of a...
Yeah, I believe I put down 3 cold case murders before I left and 1 kidnapping and rape. And I believe another assault first. So yeah, I feel really good about the work that I did in that short time period. But that was one of the hard parts about leaving, because I think there were a couple more that I could have done. And it was Matt Brotherton, who just got promoted to commander.
Congratulations to Matt.
Absolutely.
Long overdue.
Yeah.
Long overdue.
And Matt and I went through the academy together and spent over a decade together as partners in homicide. And this opportunity came up to retire or whatever, and I struggled with it. And he told us, like, Rob, you're not going to be able to solve them all. That's why we have other detectives. You go. This is a good opportunity. And it really did. It just... because, man, I could have stayed there for a long time. That challenge, you know, it's fun to wake up in the morning and know that you've got a chance to right a wrong that's been left undone for maybe a decade, 2 decades. So still got one in the works that I'm working with the Commonwealth on that maybe we do a direct indictment that's been unsolved for over 20 years. So
incredible stuff.
And I do have to say, you, I think, began working the early stages of another episode that we covered, the ex-husband of my best friend, who also was murdered this year, Angela Wooldridge, David Kelm. I think you started with that. Yes,
I touched base with the family on that one. Spoke with them several times. Very nice family.
Yeah, as you know, we've had them on here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they spoke so highly of you, and they were
nice
hoping that they were going to keep you.
Yeah, it came down to that was one of the cases that I had trouble with leaving because they were such a nice family.
Mhm.
And I think they had bad feelings towards the previous detective that handled the case, but he did a very good job of. There was only so much to go on in that one. I have my own feelings about what happened in that case, but could never ever prove anything. And again, that was one that was still on my desk when I left. So those are the ones that it hurts to walk away from.
And that pain that those families are going through, hopefully none of us ever experience that. So I got used to the idea, and I thought it was part of the obligation to be that board for them if they were frustrated, just let them take some of that frustration out on you. I can't imagine the pain that they're in. So difficult thing. So good deal. Well, maybe we can come back on some of those that you laid down.
Sure.
And get the files and do some shows on those, especially. Again, the art of pulling, like you said, 1 or 2 decades. We've done some other things on the show of late where we interviewed Karen Binder with the DNA Doe Project. An amazing thing. As a matter of fact, that's our charity of choice. And the work that they do, just simply identifying unidentified human remains, is beautiful work right there in and of itself. So well, what are we going to talk about today? Give us just like a couple of sentences on what this case is going to be about.
Yeah, it's just going to be basically it's a domestic violence murder. The victim, Todd Shoemaker, and his boyfriend, Matthew Donahue, they had lived together for approximately 5 to 6 months, and things went really, really bad on the night of January 18th, 2015.
Gotcha. Was there anything else that stood out about it, or
the violence? Mr. Schumacher was stabbed over 100 times. That's by far the most stab entry wounds that I've come across in over 20 years of investigating murders. 100 times. Think about how difficult that is, or how long that takes. For listeners out there, just smack your hand against a table 100 times. See how long that takes.
Exactly.
And just to have the energy and the anger to keep going that long.
I was skimming through some news articles, and to be honest with you, I didn't read them in depth either. I like kind of getting caught up cold with you all. I've learned.
Yeah, and as you know, I asked you the other 2 nights ago. I said, "Well, tell me about this." We were driving to dinner, and he said, "Nope, I want you to be surprised." And I hate the element of surprise because I love knowing a little bit of detail. So I'm glad. Well, I'm not glad in a way because I still wanted the detail. But why don't we just dig in? Tell us. I always love asking, what were you doing when this call came? Who found out about this to make the call? How did you get involved?
Yeah, the patrol units were dispatched, like I believe I said, the January 18th, 2015, around 7 o'clock at night. They were called to the residence. The victim's sister had gotten worried that she hadn't spoken to her brother in a while. He wasn't answering his phone, so she went over there. Nobody answered. She went in and saw the bloody mess that was all over the house, found her brother in the bedroom, and Matthew Donahue, I believe he was in the bedroom as well. She immediately called 911. The officers responded quite quickly, and believed Mr. Schumacher was pronounced dead at the scene. So at that point, obviously the homicide unit is called out. I was not on call, but I was next up for the primary in the homicide investigation. So it's 7:30. I remember exactly where I was. I was at BW3's. The playoffs were going. Green Bay was getting ready to play. I had just ordered my first beer, and my phone starts buzzing. I look down and see it's Reed Bowles, and who was a detective in the unit at the time. It's like, Reed and I are friends, but he shouldn't be calling me at 7 o'clock on a Sunday. So I just kind of sighed and was like, I know what this is. Picked up, it's like, hey, Reed.
Back across the table.
And he's like, sorry, buddy. And I was like, yeah. He goes, we have one. It's over at Lamont, which was odd because that's probably just a half mile from where I lived at the time. So at first I was worried. It's like, we don't know what kind of murder this is. Was it a shooting, a drive-by? Like, do I need to tell my kids to get in the basement or something like that? But he told me that it was a stabbing. We didn't know a whole lot right now, so they requested I respond to the scene. So I paid for my one beer that I didn't drink and responded to the scene. And they had already taken Matthew to the hospital at that point. he was, I guess, having trouble breathing or saying he had heart issue, and he had some minor wounds on his hand. So he was taken to the hospital. I learned from officers at the scene that he had stated that he and Todd were at home alone when two people entered through the back door and started yelling at Todd, and one of them attacked him with a knife. So I was given that brief synopsis, but looked around at the scene and it didn't add up. There was no knocked over furniture where, I'd mentioned that Mr. Schumacher was a large guy, 6'2", over 200 pounds. So there would have been tables turned over, chairs knocked over, but really all there was a lot of blood. And there was a pathway from the living room down the hallway to the bedroom where you could see where it's literally a body was dragged, a bloody body was dragged. So we knew more than likely that the attack took place in the living room / kitchen area, and Mr. Schumacher was taken, drugged to his bedroom.
If we can go into the technical aspects a little bit too, we talked about the responding officers and starting there. If you're in the homicide unit, what is the expectation you have when you arrive? What's the general things that you prefer patrol to be doing or have done by the time you get there?
If there's any witnesses, they don't need to do a thorough, detailed interview, but just get a basic story from whatever witnesses are around. Start a neighborhood canvass if that's the type of situation, where that could be useful. And for them to have already contacted Forensic Services Unit to respond to the scene. We want them there as fast as we can because they have to process it before we can really get in there and start our investigation.
Gotcha. And I guess the coroner comes?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, did the coroner come to this one because he was transported to the hospital?
Well, no, the suspect, Matthew Donahue, was transported to the hospital.
Thanks for straightening that out.
Yeah, but the coroner arrived, and as you know, they run the scene until they decide to hand it over to us. They're the primary investigators at any death scene in Fayette County.
Excellent.
And then also, did you still have the sister there?
Yes, there was a sister and some friends.
Was probably a very upsetting scene for her naturally, and so you had that to contend with as well as Todd.
It's always tough to deal with family members of victims, but it's especially difficult when they're on the scene and see their loved one in the state that they're in. It takes it up several notches about the grief, the anger, the sadness.
And the confusion. Why?
Yes.
Why did this even happen?
Yeah, it's one thing when we knock on a mother-father's door in the middle of the night and sit them down and calmly explain things to them. But when you see your loved one basically butchered like that, it's an image you're never, ever going to get out of your head. And I really feel sorry for the family members that have to go through that.
So did you kind of have a feeling at that moment that his partner was the suspect? Did your gut kind of tell you that was the case here?
It was certainly a possibility. You never want to let your theory get ahead of the evidence. Sure, you're allowed to have a gut instinct, but don't pay too much attention to it. We've all had gut instincts and been wrong. So, you can't help but develop a feeling, but never ever let your theory get ahead of the evidence.
So at that point, I guess you dive into your investigation. Do you go ahead and interview the boyfriend at that point, or where do you take your investigation?
We know it'd be different if we didn't know where the potential suspect would be. We knew he was at the hospital with Lexington police officers, so we knew he wasn't going anywhere. So we coordinated with Forensic Services Unit to make sure that we got a lot of pictures, got a lot of things swabbed or photographed or fingerprints that we thought we might need. And we did quite a bit of that in this case only because Mr. Donahue's version was that two unknown subjects came in. So obviously in that situation, DNA is very, very important. If we can get a DNA hit off skin cells on a doorknob that don't belong to the victim, the residents of the house, that's very useful. But as it turned out, when it turns into a domestic violence murder inside the residence, DNA is almost useless because you could expect to find victim suspects, blood, DNA, hair, skin cells, anywhere and everywhere in that house. So, but you always want to, take caution and collect all the evidence you need because you only get a crack at that crime scene once.
That makes a good point too about keeping DNA in context, because a lot of people look at it as the magic bullet, and
Yes.
it is in some cases.
In
but
certain cases,
sometimes
it's fantastic.
But in cases like this too, just like back in that crime scene too, that it enforces the reason why you don't want people traipsing through that, because of the transfer theory,
Yeah.
especially if it had that much blood.
Yes.
Because I'm going to imagine that you probably couldn't almost walk through there without.
No, this is one of those where we were dressed up like CSI. We had the booties on and all that because it was everywhere. You couldn't help but come into contact with some blood on the floor or on a table or desk or chair.
So at what point do you begin questioning Matthew?
He is released from the hospital, and he was only there for a short time, so we had him transported to headquarters where I was able to speak with him.
And so what was he stuck to his story of the 2 intruders?
Initially, yes. In that first go-around in an interview, if they're willing to talk, you let them talk. You let them tell whatever they're going to say. We call that a baseline statement. We'll just let them speak, run on for 30 minutes if they want. Because in the back of our minds, we already know what the physical evidence is telling us at the scene. So we're making mental notes and writing down notes as they're talking that either supports their theory or contradicts their theory or reasoning of what happened. So right from the get-go, it was fairly easy to pick up that he was making this stuff up on the fly about 2 invaders. So we let him tell his story and then point out a couple of inconsistencies. And at that point, he asked for a lawyer. So, and as you know, when they say that, it's done. So, but I always end the interview when they do that. It's like, listen, we're going to respect this. We're going to terminate the interview. You're going to be taken back to a holding cell. An officer will be by in probably 20 minutes, and we're going to transport you to the jail. And he's like, so I'm being arrested? I was like, absolutely you are. He's like, on what? I was like, well, your story does not match the physical evidence at the scene. There's no way 2 unknown intruders came into your home and did this. You already said that it was only you and Todd in the house and these fabricated individuals. So that just leaves you. And this is your time. If you want to talk to us, I want to hear your side of the story because maybe it will benefit you. But this story about 2 intruders is nonsense. You need to help yourself. I'm going to put you back in that holdover cell. And if you decide you want to talk to me, you can knock on the door and I'll certainly listen. So that's what we did. We put him in the holdover cell, and probably about 10 minutes later, there's an officer back there. He knocked on the door and said, I want to talk to the Detective Wilson again. I want to tell him what really happened.
Let me go to the layout a little bit, just so people can picture this when you're talking about interviewing them and holdover cells. Talk about the holdover cells, what they're like, and then the interview rooms and what they're like, and are they close to each other and things like that. Like if somebody had never been on the 4th floor, is what we called it, what's that look like, and what's the procedure for that?
Yeah, it's the Bureau of Investigations is on the 4th floor of Lexington Police Department's headquarters, and you get off the elevators and you can make a right into an office, and that's where the homicide unit is. You can make a left and you'll go into general investigations where there's cubicles of probably, David, like 40 desks of detectives up there.
Probably about right.
And then we have some administrative offices, and along the back wall, we have 3 interview rooms, which are, there's a table, a couple of chairs, carpeted, fairly nice. But then you go further down the wall and we have 3 holding cells, which is basically like a jail cell. There's a bench, nothing else in there, and it's a large steel metal door that will lock. We do have an eye hole for observation of the suspects, and basically they stay there for a short period of time until an officer arrives to transport them to the Fayette County Detention Center.
Good. That way people can picture what this looks like when you're just talking, instead of sitting around in a lobby or anything like that.
So an officer hears him knocking.
Yes.
Saying he wants to speak to you.
Yep. So we bring him back into the interview room, start the recording again. And the first thing I do in a situation like that is, did I promise you anything? Did I threaten you? Did I coerce you in any way to make a statement? Make sure that they're on tape. So no, absolutely not. So you wanting to talk to me is completely you wanting to do this. There was no contact. I made no contact. And get them to agree to that they want to make a voluntary statement. Because If you don't do that, it's going to get tossed in a suppression hearing
Yeah,
on down the
especially
road.
since he had already said he wants to have an
Exactly.
attorney present.
So yeah, you have to be really careful in making that perfectly clear on audio or video that they weren't promised anything or coerced in any way, and it was a voluntary statement on their behalf.
So how does he open it up with you?
He apologized for lying. He was scared, and then he went to what typically anybody will do in that situation, went to a self-defense strategy. Basically, badmouth Mr. Schumacher, said he was violent and mean all the time, attacked him, and he was scared. And that evening, they got into an argument, and Mr. Donahue went into the kitchen to grab a knife and held it behind his back in case Mr. Schumacher came back to confront him. He stated Mr. Schumacher came at him, and he pulled the knife in self-defense, saying, "Don't come near me, don't come near me." He said Mr. Schumacher took the knife from him, and then that they wrestled for about 5 minutes, and Mr. Donahue got the knife back and stabbed him once, maybe twice. So we know that's a lie because we know how many times he was stabbed. But, Davis, it's like sometimes you don't get full-on confessions, those admissions.
Right.
Yeah, so now we've got him admitting on tape that I did stab Todd. Doesn't matter if it was 100 times or one time. We've got him putting a knife into our victim. And from that story, also, we get rid of the two intruders. So Mr. Donahue admits to us that I'm the only one in the house, and I stabbed him once. Who did the other 99 stabbings?
Right.
So that was an important step, getting over that hurdle to admitting that he put a knife in his hand and then stabbed Mr. Schumacher.
Did he have any injuries through this 5-minute wrestling match?
Yeah, he did. They would be what we call defensive wounds. That's what he stated. But what they were slices along the hand.
Of the knife going down.
Yes, as I'm sure a lot of people know, once you stab somebody a couple times, that blood gets on the handle and makes it very slick. So when you repeatedly stab someone, your hand will slide down over the blade, causing these lacerations on your hand. A true defensive wound is if you're putting your hands up and an attacker is coming with a knife, you're going to have deep puncture wounds. We've seen them sometimes go through the hand. These were lacerations. So just due to experience and, previous murder investigations with sharp instrument objects, they'll typically, if there's multiple stab wounds, the suspect will have wounds on his hands from that hand sliding down across the blade. And there were also injuries to his wrists, which looked to be attempted suicide strikes.
How old were those?
I think he tried to do them that night.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He was, what we found out later was, we believe that the attack took place in the living room, and Mr. Schumacher was drugged into the bedroom and up on the bed, and Mr. Donahue laid with him in the bed for several hours while he was dead.
Did he have blood on his clothing that would kind of lead you to that too? And another thing too comes back to his own estimation of 5 minutes. And of course, that's an estimation.
Sure.
Of a wrestling match like that. You're right. In 5 minutes, just like 100 stab wounds, is a long time.
When you're fighting someone,
Yes, exactly.
It's an eternity.
Yeah, we know that from
Yes.
experience. And then the idea that in that 5 minutes, you're right, that parts of that house would have had to been wrecked.
Yeah.
There's no way you do that. Like we'll draw a circle and fight. It's going to be all over the house probably.
Yeah, and what we tended to believe, strangely enough, there was blood all over the floor and on the carpet and the walls, but it was like spatter and pooling, but just a little bit of pooling. I remember when we flipped the cushions over on the couch. The couch was fine. There was no blood on the couch seats. We flipped them over. There was a ton of blood, like a substantial amount of pooling on those cushions. I believe that he attacked him right there, and that's where the majority of blood loss came.
He flipped the cushions back over
Yes.
so you wouldn't see it.
Yeah.
Did he ever, or did you ever at any point tell him it's not 1 or 2 stab wounds? It's in fact 100.
I didn't know at that time how many it was. It was only till after the autopsy that we learned, but you could tell it was
more than 1 or 2.
Yeah, at least 3 dozen that I could see just visually.
And that comes back to that thing we've talked about before where you go in that room sometimes with like that much. Right? And the struggle with that is what can you do with that much?
Yeah.
But the big thing, like you said, is that I don't think I ever got told the real truth. You probably didn't.
I've
either.
never have.
But man, if you can make that window where they do something as simple as start the process and everything, but you don't have everything like they have on TV.
Right.
Right. CSI hasn't done their 28-minute DNA test yet, and definitely the autopsy's not going on down in the garage. We know that's not happening. So.
Yeah, we're not getting DNA hits in 5 minutes. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did they have a history? Well, first of all, any idea how long they'd been a couple?
about half a year,
Got a half
according to relatives and Mr. Donahue himself.
Any legal history of domestic violence? Any
No,
laws in place?
no.
I was always curious about that.
There was an interesting issue about this case. The couple shared a dog. It was primarily Mr. Schumacher's, named Monroe. And there was an argument. This was a couple of weeks before the murder. Mr. Donahue had gotten angry at Mr. Schumacher, taken his dog and put it in the oven and turned the oven on.
Hey, you know there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police Podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police Podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police Podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.